And so if you, yeah, we don't want to record this session, so I'm going to stop it. And so welcome everybody to this session on community schools, building and maintaining support and political will. As I've indicated earlier, we have over 50 people who have signed up for this discussion group, and very pleased to be participating in this as a representative of the International School Health Network and to learn more about the community schools movement. We're going to be looking at this issue of building and maintaining support as the first issue. As we go through, there's going to be some initial remarks from presenters. We're going to be starting out with Chris Jones, who is the director of the Center of Excellence for Community Schools in International Center for Excellence for Community Schools based in the UK. We have Jane Quinn from the Technical Center on Community Schools out of the US, and Adina Malkic from Russia, right, Adina? Maybe, well, Jane, or Chris, you're going to be introducing people more formally, so we'll get into that. The session today, if you are able to click on the talk button in the upper left-hand corner, please remember to, after you've made your comment, please to click off the talk button. The audio quality is better if we click on and off as a group or as individuals. And also, if you're not able to use the microphone system, typing a message into the chat box, which is the white space in the lower left-hand corner, and then clicking on the enter button in your own computer, that will send the message to the group. And I will read those messages out at the time when we're starting the discussion. You can type in a message during the initial remarks being made by the various presenters, and then we'll come back to them and read them out as we move forward. So, Chris, can I pass the session over to you and welcome everybody to it.
Thank you very much, Doug. I'm glad that you called it Community Schools Movement, because that is indeed what we're trying to achieve. We have discovered that there are somewhere in the region of 50+ countries which now have some kinds of community schools, and there are various different types of community schools, although they all tend to share certain common characteristics. For example, they are open institutions that recognize that they cannot do everything alone and need to work in partnership with others. They recognize that parents are co-educators and work closely with them. They acknowledge that there are so many issues that have an impact on children's ability to learn, and they need to form partnerships, show that they have strong leadership, and arrange a variety of services to enable children to access a relevant curriculum. So whatever their purpose is and whatever they look like, community schools share these common characteristics. However, all of us, wherever we are in the world, are affected by globalization, by climate change, by new technology, by migration, and all of these are having a huge impact on the schools, the future that we're preparing our children for, and the children's ability to access the curriculum and to learn. And so that's why I think so many countries now are looking at community schools as the way forward. But we all know too that schools and education generally is often at the center of political debate. So building community support for your community school and building up political will is, I think, a really important thing to be doing if we want to protect our community schools from political fashions. And so we decided that our first webinar will be about just that. And I'm delighted to say that we have a number of speakers from different parts of the world, and those of you who have joined as participants, you are very welcome to join in with comments or observations and your own experience as we go through this program. But first, I'm really pleased to say that Jane Quinn from Children's society in the United States is going to act as facilitator for us in this process. So Jane, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to all of you who are participating in our first webinar for the International Center of Excellence for Community Schools. We have several goals for today's session. We want to explore strategies for building support for community schools, and we want to consider different levels of support, including political, professional, and community support. And as we talk today, we may find that there are other levels of support as well, but at the very least, we want to consider those three: political, professional, and community support. We're going to have an opportunity to learn about diverse community school initiatives around the globe. I was really intrigued to hear what Chris just said, that there are over 50 countries that are implementing community schools in one way or another, and they may call them different things, but what we're talking about is a strategy that really brings partners into the school and organizes those partners to promote student success and family well-being. And finally, we're going to hear lessons learned from community school leaders about what they're doing to build support for their work: political support, professional support, and community support. These are this is a list of the people we hope to hear from today. I know Adina Malkuk is on the phone. She is the Director of Peace and the Peace and Collaborative Network in Bosnia. And I know that Ron Nolan is also on the call. He is an education consultant in Canada. I don't know if we will be hearing from Natalia or Al from Ukraine and South Africa. If they join us, we will certainly be happy to hear from them. Just want to make a few introductory comments. I have 2 slides before I turn it over to Adina. I wanted to say that it's my observation from the work in the U.S., and the work in the U.S. is, this generation of the work in the U.S. is about 20 years old, and there have been other efforts, earlier efforts in the U.S., but the current generation of community schools is about 20 years old. But what we know from the work around the globe is that in most communities, people are thinking about community schools as a long-term strategy, not as a time-limited project. So we often say community schools is a strategy, not a program. It's a strategy for comprehensive long-term change. And so in that context, we want to think about building support for community schools as an ongoing effort. It's not something you do in the beginning of your initiative and then drop it. It really means that it is part of the work. It's part of the work on an ongoing basis. And as I mentioned earlier, we also think about building support for community schools at multiple levels: political, professional, and community support. So let me define what I think of in those 3 areas, and our speakers can add on to this and talk about how these ideas touch down in their own countries. From my perspective, political support might involve policy change. It might involve the creation or the expansion of funding streams, and it might have to do with affecting the climate of public opinion. So that is, we might be working on building political will to implement and expand the community school strategy. By professional support, we often mean involving educators and other providers, people who in the community who can bring their work into schools. They might be medical, mental health, social service providers, In the U.S., an important player of professional support, a provider of professional support, have been the teachers' unions. And both of our major teachers' unions in the United States have become active members in our national coalition for community schools. So again, we'll hear from our colleagues about the professional support that they have been able to generate in their countries. And finally, when we talk about community support, we're talking about parents and other family members for sure. We're also talking about other community residents. We may be talking about area businesses that can support the work of community schools and other community resources. So that's what I wanted to say by way of introduction. And now I think it's time to hear from our presenters. So let's hear first from Adina from Bosnia.
Hello everybody, my name is Edina Malkic and I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Association Interactive Open Schools, and we work with elementary schools mostly due to the fact that elementary schools are all over the place in the cities and rural areas and in smaller units, like smaller communities. We work with the schools since our country is divided on several administrative units. We work in one canton. The name is Tuzla Canton with 13 municipalities, and we also work with schools from several schools from Osijek and Croatia, and several schools from Novi Sad in Serbia. And since 2004, we are trying to give support to the schools in the terms which we constitute that are represent community schools. We are working on developing the support for the schools, and that is something that Jane mentioned as professional support by providing some trainings, some consulting, some projects for the schools where we trying to develop their skills and give them a broader view that community is a great resource for education and fulfillment of children's needs. This means that we use experiences from, we started by using experiences from abroad, from Germany, from UK, since 2004. We try to contextualize everything and embed within our educational system and motivate schools to use these experiences as a good way to fulfill different needs and to tackle different kind of problems that families and children face since 2004. This means that we develop content based on the needs, content based on the needs of schools and all actors, students, teachers, parents, management and community. We develop human resources and we provide organizational development so that we can support schools on regional and local level, which is more greater for us. So we provide professional support for the teachers, and it's a grassroots approach on school level, since this is a big change for our schools. Our country was in the war, and we changed whole we have some system changes in our country, so schools are facing with a lot of changes and they need to do something. After the war there was many problems open, so we saw our chance to provide some tools and some experiences for the schools to face these problems. For us, the most important support must come from a Ministry of Education and pedagogical institutes, because they are responsible for the schools. But this means in terms of making the law more appropriate for the schools to develop partnership with the parents and other agencies outside of the school, or to give schools enough space to be flexible, to be open to the needs, and not only face the academic part of the schooling process. And that's why we not we, but many organizations worked on the changes in the legislative and making ministry and pedagogical institute aware that schools should work more broadly and involve resources from outside for the learning process. On school level, we need a lot of support from the head teacher, because we saw that in all the cases, head teacher is the person who opens the door for us to support school or even close it, and he or she is the person who make the atmosphere for changes. Sometimes we say we need to have one teacher who is motivated enough to make changes, but from our experiences, head teachers are the main person, because ministry and the whole system and legislature gives them this opportunity to be in power. What we have learned is that for our schools, process must start from the needs, from the base. And the schools need to realize that they need to act not only to learn, but to tackle other problems which are influencing on children learning and positive emotions. As I said, head teacher is the main person to ensure that school is changing into community school. Level of support must result of school's needs. We usually trying to communicate with the schools one-to-one and see what are the needs and what are the fields that we must develop. And for this, we usually started to developing something like a tool. How can we see what is the strong side of one community school and what is not? So as a conclusion, we now have community quality standards for community schools. This is something that gives us like a framework or quality fields which are important for one community schools to have. Professionals from system must be constantly involved into the process. That is something that we learn, and by that we mean a person from pedagogical institute which are in charge for quality work in the school, but as well teachers and school management. While trying to explain to schools and representative of educational system what community schools means, we need a tool, or we need a lot of experience, a lot of practice which will explain that community schools means a lot of things like making partnership, parents' engagement, social inclusion, community development, school culture. Everything means a lot of processes that needs to happen on school level, that if we want to have schools ready to provide children with the skills and knowledge for these challenges that Chris mentioned. Globalization, recession, and other skills they need. So basically, I agree, we need to work on political level, but in our cases, this bottom-up approach where we train and work with the people inside the school is much better for us, because people then showed the good results, the positive thing, and then this leads to policy changes and changes in public opinion. Community support is also important, and our educational system before the war had this kind of approach, and now we are reestablishing something like that. So we use different kind of organization which are working in the community and motivating them to come to school and discuss and talk about what they can do in school or outside of the school premises to develop good programs or good approaches for better education of children. So that is short what I wanted to say, but after we all present, I'm open for additional questions.
Thank you so much, Adina. That was really so interesting, and I'm very grateful to you for mentioning the quality standards that have been developed by an interdisciplinary group of colleagues from all over the world and are now being, I think, promoted by the International Center of Excellence for Community Schools. And perhaps we will talk a little bit more about that later on when we have a chance to hear from Chris again. But I'm grateful to you for such a wonderful presentation, for reminding us about the importance of context, for reminding us about the importance of the head teacher. I think we have found that to be true in our work in the U.S., and I think many other people have as well. And thank you for reminding us about the importance of broader goals. I mean, of course, academic proficiency is tremendously important, but we know that we want to pay attention to the needs and strengths of the whole child. And so it's important, as you mentioned, to continually pay attention to all of the developmental areas of the growth of young people. So thank you very much. And we will have time for some questions. And I want to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the chat box if you want to as we are going along. Or they don't have to be questions. They could be comments. So let's hear next from Ron Nolan, who is from Canada and is working currently as an education consultant. And he will tell us about his work and about what is going on in Canada to build support for community schools. Ron?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Or, I'll just proceed, and if you can't hear me, I guess you can pipe in. I've been a community education practitioner here in Canada for about 12 years now. And I started as a classroom teacher in a newly designated community school. So I saw the community schools start right from scratch, and I was a principal in community schools. We've had community schools here in Saskatchewan for the past 30 years. The community schools were originally a response to some issues that they had in some urban schools where they had a high number of First Nations, Métis students who were not being successful. They were only able to retain about 3 out of 10 of those students in the schools. So they looked at the program that were happening in Michigan and some of the programs that were happening in the United States, and modeled their community schools after those the MOTS program. And what happened over the 30 years is we started with 6 that we designated in those inner cities, and then we kept designating more schools as schools would develop the capacity and identify that they had the need. We had a combination of capacity, preparedness, rather than just saying, "Oh, you're a community school." We would make sure that they had this, like as was mentioned previously, they had some staff in place, and that they had that they were working towards specific goals of education at that time and of the program, and that they were able to have an opportunity to accomplish those goals. Like I mentioned, we had up to 98 schools designated as community schools, and in 2001, the government in place decided that the community school approach was if it benefited students who were in vulnerable circumstances, it should be able to benefit every school. And of course, in every school there are students who have vulnerable situations that they're dealing with. So we stopped designated community schools in Saskatchewan in 2001 and began to work with the school divisions in trying to have a universal approach to community education where every school is expected to align their goals with the goals of our education system and to engage their community and try to get a broad support around that. So what happened though is as it does, without the designations we had some struggles, and we looked outside of our system to the rest of Canada to see what other people were doing, and we saw that they didn't necessarily have targeted funding like we did. They had more of a global approach, and so in the more recent years we've made the funding more global and not so targeted, which allows the schools and the school divisions some flexibility to allocate funds and resources to where they see fit, rather than our prescriptive. We had nutrition and we had before and after school programs, which were basically, if they weren't doing those things, then they would have struggles getting the funding. So in this last 4 years, what we've had is we've looked at a new approach. We like I said, we've changed the way we fund our schools, and we're right now working with our school divisions to identify the best way to ensure that our students are getting equitable opportunities to succeed in school and in life. And so as a way of getting support for the schools is we've been working with them on really helping them to identify clearly articulated outcomes that align with our government goals of higher literacy and numeracy results, with having smooth transitions from school or from home to school, and from school to other organizations, and grade to grade, and then school to life, school to post-secondary, school to adult roles as citizens, as workers, as parents, and also to the other one is around having good governance. So we're trying to get information through perceptual surveys that we've implemented, so that our school community councils will be better informed and will be more able to engage the community with data that speaks to those 4 areas, and be able to engage the community in speaking with them and using that data to identify what they need to work on, what type of programs, to be able to forecast how those programs or how those approaches will change, what 3 to 5 changes will happen in the school or in the community or within individuals, and also then to evaluate. And we've been looking at social return on investment as a methodology. We're very early on that, but really what we want to know is at what rate the changes that are being proposed will occur, and how many people will be utilizing them. So who is the audience in your school? Is it for everybody? Is there a global approach, a targeted approach, and then an intensive approach? And then at what proficiency? How will we know when they're able to do the things or make the changes, and how far do we want them to go? Do we just want to get them out above the water or treading water, or do we want to get them out of the water and running along the beach kind of thing? So if I was to summarize what we've been working on here in Saskatchewan, and I can't speak to the rest of Canada, but I know it's fairly much across the board, is that we have to have, it has to be based on clearly articulated outcomes that we're working on, like I said, either for individuals, for the organization, or for the community as a whole. And it has to align with all the way through from your school to your school division or district and up to the government, and also align with your community plan. And that's one of the pieces that I think really, if I brought anything today, is the data that we collect and that we're trying to help schools collect. We want them to use that to engage their community and to be able to go to different tables like health, justice, social services, tourism, culture, those other community-based organizations and say, this is what we're doing, and this is the impact we have, but we know we have these other areas that you're working on, and this data helps you to see where you can allocate or we can align and collaborate to create a community plan rather than plans in isolation. So thank you for the opportunity today to share that. I look forward to hearing the rest of the folks speak.
Thank you so much, Ron. That was really, really interesting, and I appreciate your reminding us about the importance of using data to drive decision making. I think we're hearing more and more about that in the work of community schools across, certainly across this country, but I think also across the globe. And I'm glad you mentioned social return on investment. I think we're going to be hearing more about that. I know there are 2 new studies in the U.S. that have actually documented social return on investment in community schools, and I'd be interested in hearing if there are some studies in other parts of the world as well on that issue. But I think, you know, investors, whether they're public or private, really want to know what are we getting for our investment and why should we invest in this strategy as opposed to some other strategies. So thank you very much for your really interesting presentation, and I'm sure the Mott Foundation will be happy to hear that you built some of your efforts on their very good work in Flint, Michigan. And they are, of course, the lead funder of the International Center of Excellence for Community Schools. So thanks for mentioning our sponsor. I am looking in the chat box and see a comment about a colleague from Canada wanting to know, how do you manage to smooth out those transitions for students? The homeschool connection, the school to life connection. It must take a lot of interaction and collaboration with families, organizations, community members, and business. And so I think, Ron, that might be a question for you, although we'd love to hear from Adina and Chris and anybody else about that. So, Ron, let me pass the microphone over to you, and then we can have others join in.
Sure. Thank you, Jane. I guess what basically that is done through, like there's a number of those, you said school to home, school to life. With the school and home, what we've been really working on is an early years a piece where we have an early years branch now. So our education system used to be a K to 12 piece. Now we're looking as a province at having a pre-birth to grade 12 approach to supporting families. So the school to home piece, we're really trying to start that early on and establish that. So and with that, working with interprofessional teams as well, so that when we have students who are having challenges at school, that we include their, I guess when we're looking for our solutions, we look at the assets that they have in their life, and so we look outside and try to get those families involved with that team approach. And then as far as the school to from school to work and school to high school, again, one of the things that we're just right now starting to look at is creating pathways for students. So we're looking at our programming and saying our graduation requirements, for example, have not changed in since I was in school. So for 30-some years they haven't changed, and basically what we're trying to do is make the programs more accessible to students so that they can take the courses that they actually need to fulfill their career path, rather than trying to make everybody sort of jump through the same hoops, even though they're not going to go on to the same type of career. So it's not necessarily, it may sound like we're streaming students, but in a sense they're self-regulating and we're making accessible. So if you're interested in health sciences, we're trying to create curriculum opportunities that give students a chance to learn about their subject area, say focusing on the health sciences rather than in a general terms. So that's my best crack at a short answer for that one.
Thank you very much, Ron. I think that's a really good answer, and we have a message in the chat box. Unfortunately, Pam Boyd in Wales doesn't seem to be able to get her microphone working, but she says in Wales, we also have secondary schools reorganizing their first year provision more like a primary school to help those children who struggle with the difference from small primary to big secondary schools. And Pam had also said that in Wales they're paying a lot of attention to the transition from primary to secondary school based on the data that they have that many children disengage from education around that transition from primary to secondary school, and that they're also working with school clusters. So I guess that means schools that are in a feeder pattern with one another. So that's a very helpful notion to, and another way I think of using data to drive our decision making and to drive our interventions.
And I would be remiss not to mention that we have also dedicated resources that previously the ministry, when I mentioned that they had dedicated resources and targeted funding, one of those dedicated resources were community school coordinators or transition workers in the schools. Now, we don't prescribe that necessarily right now for every school division who has the community schools. But of course, we do recommend using best practice. So rather than limit their ability to say, oh, this school has a dedicated person who's doing transitions or who's working as a community school coordinator, we can have them allocate that person over 3 schools or a half-time position. But I would have been remiss not to mention that we do have people who are dedicated resources that are a part of the leadership team in the schools with the principal, the vice principal, and the school community council. And these community school coordinators do a lot of work with the families and with the community when they're, for example, setting up work placement or programs before and after school, or doing home visits with parents.
Now that's, I think we would have been remiss in this webinar if we didn't talk about that. If we didn't talk about both the issue of the community school coordinator, or then those people have different titles around the world, but somebody who is really a partner with the head teacher and who's working on the coordination of resources and partnerships, and also, as several people have pointed out, working on helping students make a successful transition into and then out of the school onto the next step. And I'm glad also, Ron, that you mentioned the notion of that person being integrated into the governance of the school, whether it's called a school council or a school improvement team. In New York City, we call them the school leadership teams. But the place in the school, the table in the school where the school's comprehensive education plan is formulated and overseen, I think it's very important that we use those kinds of governance and decision-making structures to build the kind of support that we're talking about on this webinar. So thank you again for that. Adina, are there any of these issues that you want to weigh in on before I open this up to the rest of the participants? And I'm glad to see we're getting more and more participants as the morning goes on. Adina, anything you want to add at this point?
Yeah, I heard, I was hearing what everybody was saying, and for us it's difficult to talk about it because we don't have that kind of experiences. We still cannot talk about the coordinator for community school in our context for now, or and we don't have even our ministry doesn't know how many children finish elementary schools and elementary schools, and then continue education on secondary, because secondary education for us is not obligatory and still, so they don't see the needs to monitor this kind of data. And usually when we work with the schools, we always ask them this question: how many of your children who are graduating from in elementary school are continuing education? And many schools don't have this answer, or they have like partial data or something like this. And situation is better in city schools, but in rural area it's something that they need to work on. And for the high schools, to make this transition smoother for the children who are coming to the totally new environment and new ways of working, we don't have a lot of support. And MIOS, as it is, we still don't work on that area, because here secondary schools are oriented to the different professions, and sometimes they don't see their role a little bit wider than to deal with the medical profession or something like that. So it's something that I wrote to myself as a very important thing to involve in our consultancy process with the school, but I must say we don't have very great experiences in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Adina. Before I open it up for other comments, I'm going to just point out that we have another comment from Pam Boyd, who's very frustrated that she can't get her microphone to work, but she's making a wonderful point here that there are a range of paraprofessionals working within schools and within local communities who support the role of the school and other partners. However, she says there is a need for a greater strategic approach, including professional development and training for these roles. And I think that is really such a good point, that we want to make sure that as we're building support for the community school strategy, that we're also building capacity. Very often, our partners who may be touching the lives of children outside of school, they may not have access to the information about what children are learning in school. They may not really know how to align their work with the work of the schools. And so I think the notion of professional development as a capacity building strategy is really a very, very important point. We have some other comments in the chat box. Question from Pam. Adina, what age do most children, I think you just answered that. You talked about there not being, that secondary school is not mandatory. And we have a comment from Ron to Adina.
Can I just add, our students finish elementary schools with 15 years of age. Then I think, but this is my impression, most of them continue through high school, and they finish high schools with 18 or 19 years of age, differences with the months. And if they continue formal education at university level, they finish with 25. So that is how our educational system is. I just wanted to add to this comment of Pam. Yes, I think that just to see the last one that Jane has read. We as an NGO, we are trying to give this professional development and trainings about these roles for the teachers. Sometimes it's a parent, sometimes it's somebody from the management, depending which level of of work it is based on whole legislative. We have to balance between what our country or policy level is prescribing and what we can embed and make it more flexible. So we don't have coordinators, but we are trying to give message to the schools that this development and education of children really depends on the school. Nobody else will do anything if they are not awakened and don't decide, okay, we have children, we have this problems or issues or challenges, what can we do and with whom to make it better for the children. So we are trying to work with them, and I must mention standards. We say, okay, you need to work on leadership issues, or you need to work on parental engagement, and that is something that we cannot accept to be done in one school year. It's a several years process for one school, and with all changes in education and school, it's an even longer period of time. So we see ourselves as a supporter to the schools to understand that they need to have skills to think about what kind of programs or activities or any support they need to provide to the children and families in order to obtain these outcomes that Ron has talking about, because we have them, but our teachers are disappointed because children are not achieving these outcomes, and the reasons are not because they cannot learn. The reasons are something totally different, and these reasons lie in the community and the changes the children face, and school is still on one place. And well, I will stop now.
No, thank you, Regina. That was really, really terrific. Ron is making a great point, I think, in the chat room, talking about making sure that we're paying attention to the right indicators and that we're paying attention to the ones that are leading indicators rather than trailing indicators. That if we wait until we find out we have a problem with graduation rates, we may be waiting too long to intervene. And so we want to be looking at issues like early literacy. And I will say in the U.S. we're paying a lot of attention to another leading indicator, which is the whole issue of chronic absence, by which we mean children who are missing 10% or more of the school year. And if we intervene when we see a pattern of chronic absence, or when we see, as Ron points out, an issue of lack of reading proficiency in the early grades, it gives us time to intervene and make sure we're getting kids back on track so that they really will have an opportunity to succeed in school. Let me open this up for any questions or comments from our growing number of people who are in the webinar with us. So if you want to speak, please turn your microphone on and let us know who you are and what you'd like to say.
Jane, it's Doug here. Just to first of all compliment the remarks, the people making the remarks earlier. I really encouraged to see the sense of a system of looking at different aspects from bottom up and top down and sideways in. It's very helpful, and as a person who's worked primarily with the Healthy Schools movement over the last several years, which comes from a medical background, that's a lesson that they need to learn from more community-minded movements like the Community Schools movement, is that we're looking at a series of multiple systems at multiple levels, and it's an ongoing process. I had one thought that that's coming out of a reaction to two ideas, very practical ideas that are very good ones. Using the issue of transitions and using the issue of student absences as a way of garnering support within the school systems. I think it's very important that we become relevant to them. But I guess it's the ongoing relevance that we need to always be working on, not short-term, but important, urgent issues that are the focus of the communities that we're trying to go into. That was a lesson that was taught to me when I was a community organizer in Quebec, dealing with minority communities, and we use schools as the basis for, particularly in northern Quebec, organizing communities around the school as a center of the community. And it's very important to go in and first listen to what their immediate concerns are, but then to have an ongoing listening process, so that the big philosophy of a community school or a healthy school or a safe school, that we're always addressing the urgent issues that they're concerned with immediately within a long-term systematic kind of approach.
Thank you, Doug. And let me turn this back over to Chris Jones, who is the director of the International Center of Excellence for Community Schools, for any final comments.
Thank you very much, everybody. I found that an absolutely fascinating discussion. There are one or two observations that I'd like to make, if I may be allowed. I'll try and be brief. First of all, I'd just like to tell you a little about last week, because last week we had what I might call a Seeing is Believing session. We were visited by about 25 head teachers and teachers from the Czech Republic. They remain a little bit skeptical about the idea of community schools, partly because they've tended to be associated only with Roma communities, and therefore need a little bit of persuasion for them to see that they might actually have something to offer their children. So they came over here, and we took them around several schools here in the city of Coventry, which is where I happen to live. And they were knocked out by the number of activities that were going on in the schools, particularly in relation to smoothing the way between home and family, and especially for those communities which are often traditionally quite difficult to enter, such as closed minority ethnic groups, for example, or distressed families that are having multiple problems. And the amount of time and effort that is going into building up that relationship between school and family, they were amazed at. But furthermore, that builds that kind of grassroots political, the grassroots community support, which can then develop into more of a political movement, if you like. Another point I'd like to just touch upon, I suppose it relates to that in some ways, is that Ron was talking about funding and designated community schools. Well, unfortunately, of course, in many of our countries, schools become community schools because the leadership of the school believes in that, but very often it's without additional funding or without a particular designation. However, we have found that where good solid partnerships are forged, then a synergy happens, so that you end up with, I suppose, more for your bucks. So it may not cost you any more money, but you can bring in additional services. So, for example, we visited a school last week where there was a section of the school that was no longer in use, and with some business sponsorship, the head teacher, proving to be something of an entrepreneur, opened that up and has work for early years, and also has a lot of work with individual families going on there, including things like advice on breastfeeding, on weaning, and on early childhood development, so that parents are used to coming to the building for a range of support services right from the off, before their children even enter school. A few people have also mentioned the idea of monitoring data. I'll return again, if I may, just briefly to the international quality standards, because we've tried these now in about something like about 13 countries in hundreds of schools, And the reports back that we're getting is that when they are used, and we recommend that the schools look at how they're performing against a number of indicators, and that they do this with their partner agencies, with the pupils, with the parents, and with the wider community. And that when they do that, they found that they've got a lot more support in the community than they thought they had, and that they find that they're far more able to articulate what it is that they're trying to achieve. And that has certainly been important. One school in Armenia just recently wrote to us saying that they have increased the number of pupils from 900 to 1,400 as a result of doing the international quality standards, because it's helped them to have the confidence to reach out into the community and talk more about what they're doing. So that sounds to me like good news. It's also important because in a number of the countries with which we work, this whole kind of managerial approach that we're used to in the West is often missing. So the idea of planning for the future, of really detailing what you want to achieve, when you want to achieve it, and how you'll know you've got there, is still quite new. So any kind of mechanism, it seems to me, that will help teachers and others that are supporting community schools to be able to offer qualitative and quantitative data, I think is to be applauded, because it will help, I'm sure, to build that community support and to build the political will that we need to protect our schools from the fashions of politics at any time.
Hello. So I think this is, thank you so much, Chris. And this is Jane. I'm going to, unless there are any other comments, I think we will say job well done to you all over the world. And we want to thank everyone who joined us for this first webinar. And you are, I'm sure, on the email list from the International Center, and you will be invited to a whole series of webinars. There's going to be one each month this year, and I know Chris and her colleagues are making a great effort to involve colleagues from all over the world. So please join us again for the next webinar. And Chris or Doug, do you want to mention when it is?
Yes, December 11th at the same time, same start time as today.
And that's going to be about research. It's what research we found so far and what research we believe still needs to take place.
So today's session with a major focus on data is the warm-up act for that next session. So thank you, everyone, and have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Everybody can exit by choosing select file and then select the exit button. That would be great.